So good morning, everybody. My name is Jason Patlas. I'm the president of the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, and it's a delight to welcome everybody back for our third and final day of Capitol Hill Ocean Week 2013. To start the morning's discussion, it is my great honor and privilege to introduce Senator Carl Levin. Now, everybody knows Senator Levin for his chairmanship of the Senate Armed Services Committee, a committee on which he served since he joined the Senate, first in 1978. We also know Senator Carl Levin for his leadership in the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. And within that committee, he serves as chair of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. And in that role, we know the senator and his sharp legal acumen and his precision in challenging many affairs over the years that have warranted public scrutiny. And so we thank Senator Levin for his work on that. We also know Senator Levin for his chairmanship of the Great Lakes Task Force, through which he has done great work in protecting the Great Lakes economy and environment on behalf of all the residents in that region. What we in this room also know Carl Levin for is his support of the Great Lakes marine and waters, and in particular the establishment of the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary. And one of the nice things about that is promoted on the senator's bio when you go to his website. It's not often that you find members of Congress really promoting the work they do on behalf of our national marine sanctuaries, and we thank the senator for everything that he's done since the establishment of the sanctuary, the construction of the Maritime Heritage Center in Alpena, Michigan, which has become a central point, as we heard yesterday, for tourists from around the country. And we will miss the senator greatly when he retires at the end of his term next year. So with that, Senator, let me invite you up to the podium. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Jason, thank you so much, and thanks to the foundation for the great work that you do. That fabulous marine sanctuary in Alpena that you heard about yesterday and that many of you know about just has been provided some fabulous support by the foundation, and as have the other marinas in this country, and we're very grateful for the work of the foundation. You heard from Jeff Gray yesterday about this Thunder Bay sanctuary that we're so proud of. It's unique, and I think you've heard that story in terms of how and why it's unique in so many ways. One of the folks who have also made it possible for that sanctuary to be there is Alice Yates, who's on my staff, and she does work in so many of these areas, including the sanctuary area. And because so many of you either know her or should know her, I want to actually single her out. I don't always embarrass staff this way, but I do this morning. And I don't know where she is, except she walked in with me. Alice, stand up just for a second. I know that when you use the word oceans, you include the Great Lakes. We consider those our oceans, by the way, so there's no disconnect between the use of the word oceans and Great Lakes, but we're particularly happy when the Great Lakes are recognized as kind of our inland oceans. Those of us who live anywhere near the Great Lakes are extremely possessive of the Great Lakes. They are part of our DNA. They affect us in so many ways, economically, drinking water. Our soul is wrapped up literally in those Great Lakes. If we live anywhere near the Great Lakes, they're really an essential part of our being. But I want to talk to you because this is Ocean Week, and I know you're near the end. I want to just spend a couple minutes with you this morning on the subject which you're putting some focus on, which is the role of the media. And I will start with the proposition that I suspect most of us, including some of the journalists here, would agree that the issues which are being discussed during Ocean Week just don't get as much attention as we'd like or as much attention as they deserve. Of course, one of the biggest factors here is that the issues involving our waters are not nearly as substantive as the latest Hollywood breakup or a wardrobe malfunction or something as important as that. And by the way, before I proceed any further, I believe that Jason made reference to the fact that I am the co-chair of the Great Lakes Task Force. But in any event, I want to also pay tribute to the co-chair of the Senate Task Force, Mark Kirk. He's overcome some real obstacles of his own in order to come back to the Senate. He's someone who's one of the folks who really is able to work across the aisle. We do this on a bipartisan basis, work together on Great Lakes issues, and so I want to pay tribute to him. I don't think he is here, but I want you to know, if you already don't, that the Great Lakes Task Force is a bipartisan task force, and that's the way it should be, because these issues involving the well-being of our waters, our great waters, are surely not partisan issues. But let me go back to the question of the question of our media. Why is it that we don't think the issues that you're here discussing get the attention that they deserve? I suggest that there's a number of reasons. First, the issues which affect these waters, whether it's climate change, whether it's in the case of the Great Lakes, invasive species, toxic cleanup projects, habitat restoration, are not as easily boiled down as other issues for a cable news debate or for a headline. These are complex issues frequently, and the time and space which is needed to explain them to readers and viewers is limited. So that's number one. Number two, some of these issues seem distant, and so they're less pressing. Climate change seems distant. The facts that our waters are receding, we got some good news about Lake Superior, but generally our waters in the Great Lakes are receding. It's been going on for some time now. The recent Army Corps of Engineers and NOAA's monitors showed that the water levels on Lake Michigan, Lake Huron had dropped to their lowest point since recorded observations began 150 years ago. So they seem distant. The waters seem to be gradually coming down. Climate change is an issue which, for some people, seems to be a distant issue. It's a gradual kind of a threat. As a matter of fact, it's in terms of the waters receding and the probably being caused by climate change is not a distant issue at all. It's actually a very here and now issue in the Great Lakes because of the fact that our harbors are now less open to shipping, less open to the economy, which is dependent on harbors being open. We have major dredging needs in the Great Lakes, which are not adequately funded at all, and that's a huge debate in the Congress about using harbor maintenance funds for the purpose that they were created and provided by the industry. So it is a here and now issue, but again, some of these issues at least seem to be distant in fact. Outside, there's not enough attention paid to the issues for that reason as well. But there's another aspect of this. The other side of the coin is this: with all the challenges that we face and that you hear about and that you're worried about and you're determined to do something about all the issues affecting our waters, there's also some good news stories, and it's important that the public see that we can succeed. Not just that they are told about the challenges and that we use our best efforts to dramatize challenges, but also where we have some successes, and there are successes, particularly where there's a role of government in helping to create those successes, that there be a much greater effort to focus on what we can get done, so it's not just a constant bombardment of negative news. The media tends to focus on negative, on threats, on conflicts. I guess this is a long fact of life for those of us in public life and those of us who aren't, that the media tends to focus on the dramatic or the conflict and the fights that go on and the battles that are waged and the kind of difficulties that we are trying to meet, that we're faced with. But if we can do a better job of showing the public where, hey, we're spending some money that is working, that will help to give the public a much greater sense that things can change for the better, and that things are changing for the better, and that it makes a difference as to whether or not we are sequestering funds that are going to a Great Lakes restoration initiative or to other causes. It matters. But unless they see not just the threat and the challenge, but unless they also see the successes and understand the difference that funding and energy and effort and partnerships can make, we're losing an opportunity to win these battles as well. I mean, just picking out, I asked Alice just to give us some of the recent success stories with use of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funds, a major bill for the Great Lakes, which President Obama promised in his first campaign and delivered in his first budget. Just recently, we're working on the EPA lifted restrictions on eating fish from 2 West Michigan lakes. This is Great Lakes restoration money. Fish and Wildlife Service is moving is now in the process of removing the largest dam removal process and habitat restoration project ever in northwest Michigan near Traverse City. Deer Lake in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, a $6 million initiative there to remove mercury contamination. Is removing this lake from the agency's area of concern list. Now, each of these projects, and hundreds like them around the country, whether in the Great Lakes or on our oceans, on our coasts, are success stories. And the public needs confidence, or else they're not going to continue funding. They're going to continue the roads to sequestration, what difference does it make, and so forth. Kind of the negative view that the Tea Party reflects about the role of government. That's going to continue to have too much success and impact unless we can not just demonstrate the threat, but also dramatize the successes. And so that's our responsibility to do that. And that's part of I think, the challenge in attracting media attention. So I'll close, and I've got to run immediately back to the Capitol. Thank you. I'll close with that. Thank you for focusing on the need to protect our great waters, the need to educate the public about the challenges that are faced. The role of journalists is absolutely critical. We thank you for those of you who are journalists, for being part of that profession. Again, this is it's a fabulous, it's just not just an opportunity, it's a tremendous responsibility, those of us that have that responsibility to protect our waters. The waters are our treasure, and being part of a effort which involves thousands and thousands of people and hundreds of organizations to protect our great waters is something that I will always cherish. And it was mentioned that I won't be running for re-election in a year and a half, but somewhere on that list of things that I'm very, very happy to have been part of will be the role of a sanctuary such as we have in Thunder Bay, but also the fact that I was given for a short period of time. The part of the responsibility to protect our waters is something that I will always treasure. Thank you for joining in a great effort.
Senator, thank you very much for your remarks and for your leadership on these issues in the Senate. We will miss you when you step down at the end of your term. To start the next panel, it's my great pleasure to introduce the moderator, Sunshine Menezes, who's the Executive Director of the Metcalf Institute for Marine and Environmental Reporting. The Foundation's been proud to work closely with the Metcalf Institute in a number of ways over the recent years, including as a funder through our Hollings Grants program, and having Sunshine here in previous years, both for CHOW and at our Leadership Awards dinner, where we announced the Grantham Prize for Environmental Reporting last year. Sunshine is also the Associate Director for Communication in the Office of Marine Programs at the University of Rhode Island Graduate School of Oceanography. Prior to joining Metcalf Institute, she worked with U.S. Congressman Frank Pallone, and currently she serves as a leader of the team at URI, or previously she's worked with URI Coastal Resources Center and Rhode Island Sea Grant, developing an innovative urban coastal management policy for Rhode Island's Narragansett Bay. This morning's panel really takes advantage of our new venue here at the Newseum, and Sunshine will introduce the rest of the panelists, and I'd like to remind everybody that we've got volunteers, and if volunteers can raise their hands with question cards. If you don't have them at your seat in your packages, please give them to the volunteers or bring them up to the stage for the discussion later. Sunshine?
Thank you, Jason. Good morning, everyone. And welcome to the Newseum. This certainly is an appropriate place for us to be gathering to have this conversation today. And I'm very pleased to be joined by a really impressive panel of journalists here. Let's do some quick introductions. All of their biographies are in your packet, so I encourage you to read those fully. But starting here to my left, we have Mark Schleifstein, who is an environment reporter for NOLA.com and the New Orleans Times-Picayune. Very, very multiply awarded environment reporter. And again, I encourage you to read his biography. Seth Borenstein, to his left, is a science writer for the Associated Press. And again, multiple awards here. Seth primarily writes about climate change, but he has also covered ocean issues and space and many things. But he's a really stellar contributor to the flow of coverage on climate change. So if you haven't been following him, you should be. And then to his left, we have Kevin McCary, who is a documentary filmmaker, again, award-winning, and he won an Emmy for his documentary film, and formerly a producer with National Geographic, and an author of this book, Islands Under Fire, The Improbable Quest to Save the Corals of Puerto Rico, which we will talk about a little bit more this afternoon. And also, he teaches filmmaking at the Savannah College of Art and Design. And then finally, to his left, we have Curtis Brainerd, who is a staff writer for the Columbia Journalism Review. And also, he writes a column, a regular column called The Observatory, about science and environment reporting. And he will offer some really valuable insights about the field in general in a few minutes. So before we begin, I just wanted to say thank you to Jason and Jeb and all of the staff here who make this great event happen. This is a really phenomenal program, and we're glad to be here for it. So thank you for having us. And thank you for including this very important conversation. This is a first for CHOW to be talking about news coverage so overtly. And we're really excited to help you all understand a little bit more about how professional journalists operate. I am just going to ask a question which I pretty much know the answer to quickly, which is, how many of you have ever grumbled to yourself or to others about coverage of science, the environment, ocean issues? Just quick show of hands. Okay, so that's pretty much what I expected to see. And I do this because, of course, this is not a secret. This happens a lot. And I think that one of the things that's really important to understand is that there are a lot of phenomenal, talented, professional journalists who are covering these issues and doing it well. But it helps to have some insight about how they do their jobs so that you can better understand that sometimes they'd actually like to do more of this coverage and those opportunities don't arise with the frequency that many of us would wish. Not to give the profession a free pass here. I completely agree with Senator Levin that we need to see a lot more coverage about ocean issues, about environment issues generally. And so, without spending too much more time as an introduction, I would like to jump in here. And we're going to start by talking about kind of process and function a little bit in a newsroom. And so I'm going to start by asking Mark this question, but really this is open for the whole panel. How do you decide what to cover? Who makes these decisions, and what kind of process is involved in this?
Right now, we've gone through major changes at our product. I don't even know what the heck to call it anymore. We have a reporter who says, I work for a website that's in a mall. which is actually an accurate portrayal. Our newspaper has gone to 3-day-a-week publication for delivery, and it's about to go back up to 7 days a week, but not for delivery. The other 4 days will be in newsstands. But we all now work for the website, and our stuff is taken from the web and put into the newspaper, and no one understands how that works, including us. But the reality is, I'll give you an example of how this works. I have been following tropical storm that's been happening that formed last night. The last couple of days, I've been watching how it's been gathering up steam to form. And so yesterday, at the end of our session, I went back to my hotel room and I started writing a story saying this is about to happen. And just as I was ready to push the button to put that up on the web, it happened. And the Hurricane Center declared it a tropical storm. I had to change the story and clicked a button and it went up on the web. I wrote it. No one edited it. I put the pictures in. I did the whole thing. It's up on the web. Then I sent a note to my editors saying it's up on the web, go do something with it, and they went back through and checked it. That is the new world of journalism that we live in today, and it is not necessarily a satisfactory world, but it is the way things are going to be in the future. In terms of what I cover, I have a great luxury in that I basically set what I'm going to cover, and it's basically set by the events that are occurring in New Orleans. I cover reconstruction of the levee system post-Katrina, hurricanes and their effects, coastal restoration, the BP oil spill, and everything that's coming out of that. And I basically decide every day what I'm going to write and then tell my editors what I'm going to write, and sometimes they ask to edit it before it goes up, and sometimes they don't. And a lot of times my product will go online in a longer form than most reporters have the luxury of doing, and then it'll be chopped down and put into the next print edition of the newspaper.
Seth?
I actually have a little bit of a different situation than Mark. I think that's, I'm pretty happy that it's different. But first, when Mark covers all, gets to choose what he does and dictated by what's happening around New Orleans, I sort of dictated by what's happening. I was going to say the world, but it's actually larger. I mean, if something is happening in another galaxy and Hubble Space Telescope sees it, I have to cover it. So much of what I write about is reactive. I don't set my agenda as much as I'd like. I try to. I have essentially two tracks at all times. I have the daily news. Here's what's happening. We have to write about this. And then some kind of enterprise project that when I have a moment, I get back to it. And sometimes I could do that story in a week. Sometimes it takes me months. Sometimes it only takes me 2 or 3 days. It depends on what's happening. Like Mark, I was following Tropical Storm Andrea, and that was one of the things that changed what I was doing yesterday. So one of the things, for example, just to talk about what Senator Levin talked about, because I disagree with so much of what he said. You all think we don't cover ocean as much. I'm willing to bet you that if you looked at the congressional record and counted how much time is spent on ocean, and then you look at the output of the Society of Environmental Journalists reporters, National Association of Science Writers, we far have a greater percentage of ocean coverage than Senator Levin and his colleagues have in what they talk about. We are essentially mirrors. We're trying to reflect what is happening in the world. And if no one is talking about the oceans, or no one in power is talking about the oceans, there's going to be less of it. So, this is the reality. If they're spending all their time talking about terrorism, which kills far fewer people than climate change, that's what you'll see more often on the news. Now, the other part of this is, I agree with Senator Levin where he talks about good news as being important. And I'll tell you this, I love a good news story. Now, he has it wrong in terms of what is a good news story. I don't care about a certain program working or not working. It's the results. When a species is taken off the endangered species list, that's a great good news story. It's not this program has started or this program has moved to this thing. And that's one of the things I want to encourage you to do. Don't think bureaucratically. Think in terms of big picture stories, ideas, narratives, something you would talk to in your neighbor. That's what I like to write about.
Thank you, Seth. That's a great segue, actually, for Kevin, the idea of narrative. And Kevin, with your background as a producer and a filmmaker, can you tell us how that differs from this sort of daily news approach?
Well, basically, it takes so long to make a documentary film, and it takes a long while to write a book. So the approach is pretty different. At National Geographic, step one is to write a one-pager. And this is sort of the lingua franca for getting your film made. And what's in that one-pager are things like, is your idea original? Is it feasible? Do you have interesting characters? Do you have interesting visuals? I'll give you an example of a good friend of mine, it was a film I supervised, did a film on killer whales. You think, well, there's been a lot of films done on killer whales. Well, why is your film different? Well, ours is called The Secret Killers of Monterey Bay, and it's about transient killer whales. These aren't the free willies that happily chatter and everything. These are basically mammal hunters who are very quiet and deadly. And we thought, okay, that's kind of interesting, the secret killers. He says, but that's not who the secret killers are. The secret killers are the PCBs that are killing the killer whales. And so right away, that elicited a great deal of interest. So the next question was, okay, can we do this? Is it feasible? And the filmmakers said, well, it turns out that these transient killer whales wait in Monterey Bay for the gray whale migration. And it happens once a year. And so we can get our boats out there. It's very expensive, you know. It's not like these guys who get to sit in front of a word processor. You know, you've got to rent boats, you've got to have underwater camera people, you've got to have like a whole team, and it's a lot of money to do this. So you want to hope that you're going to be able to pull it off. And they do come every year like clockwork, except when they don't. And they didn't come for 2 years, by the way. But in any event, then after you've sort of pitched the idea through the one-pager, you'll have, if that gets through stage one, now you have a meeting with probably about 20 people in the room. And it will be people from international sales, people from DVD sales, researchers, people from the channel, National Geographic Channel, people from PBS. You know, there's a sea of people out there. And now you've been able to refine your idea a little bit more and come up with a schedule and come up with a budget and say, yeah, we have this wonderful character. She's a biologist. She's been following these for years. She is the Ahab of killer whales in Monterey Bay. And they either, you actually, if you're a filmmaker, they ask you to leave the room, which is kind of weird. And then everyone kicks it around and say, yeah, God, you know, the Brits love these kind of films, you know, so we see good sales there. The Japanese will love it, you know, that'll work. We see DVD sales, we see all these things possible. Yeah, let's green light it, you know, or not. Whereas in terms of my other long-term project was writing the book. And the development project or process was much different. I turned to my wife, Fran, and I said, you know, I think I want to write a book about the time when I was in Puerto Rico and we were trying to save the coral reefs when the Navy was bombing the island of Culebra. And she says, so what else is new? Did you take out the garbage this morning? I say, yeah. Okay, green light, get to write the book, you know. Much easier. So anyway, that's the difference with the two processes between developing a book and developing a documentary.
Thank you, Kevin. So, Curtis, do you, based upon your kind of global picture about what's going on in the science and environment reporting world, do you have anything to add in terms of what you see as differences for various reporters and their approaches?
Well, you know, I mean, it very much depends on the medium, of course, and in terms of my own approach, what I'm out there doing is very much what any reporter is doing. I'm paying attention to the biggest stories of the day. Like Seth said, I'm sort of a mirror for what's happening out in the world, except that I'm not covering topics like the oceans and the environment directly. I'm following how guys like Seth and Mark are covering these issues. So I'm, reporting on the media and what it's doing, to the extent that, something is a big story in any given week, I'll cover how the media is handling that story. And I tend to focus on the biggest stories of the week, just as Seth and Mark tend to do. And I tend to focus on the largest news outlets, the ones that are having, the greatest impact among the general public and the ones that have the greatest outreach. I do try to cover, some of the smaller outlets as well to the extent that I can, but, my main concern is, critiquing, the major stories that are, influencing public decisions and public behavior. Unfortunately, I don't get quite enough of a chance to do film reviews and book reviews and cover the types of media that Kevin's really involved in, which is a shame because books and movies often can have a much larger influence and a much more kind of lasting institutional memory within the public than just kind of the day-to-day coverage of these issues. But for the most part, again, it's what's happening in the media. And I'm sure that Seth and Mark face this problem too. One of the big challenges is not actually what the media is reporting on, but what the media isn't reporting on. Likewise, they're trying to cover what the government isn't doing sometimes. And so, to take one example related to the ocean specifically, I wrote a piece last summer almost exactly a year ago about how the media had essentially taken a pass on the efforts to institute an integrated national ocean policy. There was just next to zero interest in this. I'd kind of been following it on my own, saving bookmarks for, a year or so. It was a long process, and I kept waiting for, kind of a big news splash or some big takeout on it. And, there were a few things here and there, but ultimately nothing. So I think that's actually kind of one of the biggest challenges, whether for me as a media reporter or for any, environmental reporter on the beat, is, what isn't happening that should be happening, whether that's, a public effort or a private effort.
So I have really been involved with environmental journalism for about 7 years now, since I started working with Metcalf Institute, and we do science training for journalists to improve environmental news coverage. And in that time, I came into this job at about the ground zero moment when everything went kaplooey in the news industry. And so since then, it's actually much better than it was for a few years there. It was pretty scary. Journalists were losing their jobs left and right. It was a horrifying thing to observe. But even though everything has kind of moderated a little bit since then, there, as Mark alluded to, have been some very significant changes in how news is collected and disseminated. And I'd like to talk about that for just a few minutes. When we were preparing for this panel, Mark made reference to the river of news on NOLA.com. And I think that this is a really interesting idea that we should dive into a little bit so that people understand what you mean when you say that, and how, to what degree users of a website, those people who are actually going to NOLA.com to learn about their news, are controlling what shows up there, and to what degree the newsroom is controlling what shows up there.
Okay, so let's back up for a second, and you hear about this room of people who are saying, gee, this is how we're going to monetize your film. Well, we have a room of people, too, who are trying to figure out how to monetize the internet, and they can't figure it out, and they start talking in terms about metrics, which drives us crazy because it sounds like story count to us, which it is. But that's one of the key things, is how do we get people to read our stories? And one of the key ways of doing that is make sure that you have the front page of your website is something that's visually attractive, while at the same time it's changing every second so that there's something new on it, so that people will come back as often as possible. When we went through our initial changes over to this new process back in October of last year, we had a river of news. On most of the website was taken up by stories that would change every 2 seconds. And so the stories at the top would fall down to the bottom, and no matter what their importance was. The newsroom screamed and yelled about that and got changes. And what happened was that we now have at the top of the page, you've got a variety of different stories that are considered by the editors to be the most important for a 6-hour, 8-hour, 12-hour period, depending on what the importance of those stories really are during the day. And those stay there. And they may put up big red bulletin messages at the top of that, and pictures and things like that, just to help visualize it. But the river is still there. So what does that mean in terms of the kinds of coverage that we get? Well, I looked at the last 7 days for a service that provides us. My stories in the last 7 days ranked number 20 on our site with 38,130 hits. Not much. AP was number 1 with 101,000 hits. Of those stories of mine, the biggest story actually was the Tropical Storm Andrea story of last night, which had 13,200 as of early this morning. And the story that I wrote Wednesday night out of this meeting had close to 2,000 views as of last night. So that's an example of how people are using our process. Now, our concern is that the numbers crunchers will look at these and say, write more about hurricanes and write less about global warming. But the reality is that we still have some control over that and recognize that, well, actually we've got people who want to have their ads on the stories, next to the stories that I'm writing about. So that helps as well.
And I'm actually would be glad to have the metrics that Mark has. Until recently, AP, first a little, the Associated Press is the world's largest news organization, but we're also a nonprofit consortium. We're owned by our members. So for many, many years, we didn't really have a website. Well, everyone else did because we're not supposed to compete with the Times-Picayune. So that kind of when you're trying to deal in the modern internet age, try doing that without a website for all your stories to go. About a year or two ago, we created AP Big Story, and to be honest, I don't even remember the exact. If you just do AP Big Story, Google that, you'll find it. But it's not even got the metrics that Mark has. It is we're not supposed to compete with our owners, which makes sense, they own you. On the other hand, so the stories go out everywhere. My stories are far more likely to be read on NOLA or in the Washington Post or any other, or on television station. So I don't know who's reading. I don't know how many people are reading. My bosses have been desperate to try to come up with metrics. Used to be front pages of newspapers, but now that doesn't matter as much. Then used to be Yahoo top news stories, but now that doesn't matter as much. Then it was this Google News Analytics, but they don't quite know how that works. And so every few weeks we get this concept of what kind of metrics are we going to use. And in some ways that frees you because you're not being told, well, we need this type of story because this is what gets read more often. We don't know what gets read in many ways. We know what our members want, and we essentially know what news is. And so that's a little freeing. But there's so much of it. The idea is I essentially get several hundred emails every day. And of story ideas sent to me, I would say 95% of them I have to say no to. And then I go to my boss, and about 90% of things I think are interesting, she says no to. So if you do the math, we're talking at a very, you're talking about 1 in 100, maybe less, story ideas that come into the transom come out. So it's very difficult. We have a very high bar, and then we just don't know where it goes. But it's everywhere. It's sort of like if he's the river of news, I'm the jet stream of news. It's out there, it's there, and it's affecting everything. but you just can't grab it or put your finger in it.
Good metaphors. All right, so lots of reactivity here in the news industry at the moment. And we could go quite into a lot more detail on the whole economic constraints and how social media has changed the news industry. But I'd like to switch gears a little bit right now and start moving into more about how journalism and science especially intersect and don't. And then we'll talk some more about some specific ocean-related topics. So, Seth, tell us, this is something that Seth talks about quite often. So give us your perception about these intersections.
Well, I think in many ways you remember the book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. Scientists are from Mars, and reporters are from Uranus, or as most people would like to call it, Uranus. We're totally different in terms of the way we think. If you think about it, a good scientist thinks in cool, incremental data, very data-oriented, and it's not emotional. It's very subjective. Takes a long time to do good science. I know that. As a reporter, I'm looking for heat and emotion. I'm looking for conflict, and I'm looking for new stuff, and I'm looking for something that's short and just very concise. So you could not ask for two more different worlds. And there are only a few places where they come together. And the places where science and climate and journalism come together are in people like us. And so it's climate change. It is where science affects you in your daily life. But the trouble is what you do takes so long. And if you get this much of a change, it's worth a paper in Nature or Science or wherever. But it has to be something truly different for it to interest me. And then, so you also have to know there are different types of reporters. The political reporter won't have any idea, or the general assignment reporter. It's those of us who specialize in science and environment writing. So you have to know, we're in that sort of, if you think about it as a Venn diagram and the two circles that don't meet or barely meet, it's us environment and science reporters that you have to know because we're the ones you essentially deal with. And then there are good scientists who are very media savvy, who are ones we deal with. And for example, in New Orleans, Nancy Rabel. I mean, you couldn't ask for a more media savvy scientist. Jane Lubchenco, until she went to the dark side of government, was very good. Yeah. And then I think I saw Justin back there, right? Yep. And then come the Gulf of Mexico, come the BP oil spill. Yeah, it was totally different Jane Lubchenco than I ever saw. Of course, we didn't get to see her much because she was being hidden, right, Justin?
I'll add something about that. In terms of documentary filmmaking, it's even more difficult because the scientists not only have to be sort of articulate, but they also have to be personable. They're on camera. They're characters. They have to be interesting. And I remember I was doing for National Geographic again a film called Sea Monsters about the search for the giant squid. It was an interesting film because what we did was we put a critter cam on the back of sperm whales. Because sperm whales hunt giant squid in the hopes that the cameras would capture sperm whales feeding on squid down below. But our main scientist was out of the Smithsonian, Clyde Roper, and he was wonderful. He had an Ahab beard. He had a New England accent. He was obsessed like Ahab, but not with the whale, with actually seeing the giant squid. And I interviewed another scientist in that same show. And after the interview was over, I turned to my camera and I said, I have no idea what he just said. Do you? He said, no. So anyway, those are the two extremes. And it's great when you find a media-friendly scientist from our point of view. However, on the other hand, scientists have to be much more cautious in what they can say because they know that there are, rival scientists in the community who are going to be weighing every single word they say and saying, well, boy, that's a bunch of baloney, you know. Where did they come up with that idea? So it's hard to get that strong, powerful, assertive soundbite that you want in your film when you're interviewing scientists on camera.
Kevin, so what makes a good science or environment story then, from your
A story, well, it's interesting. When I was writing the book, I had to go through the process of whether this would be worth a year or more of my life trying to write this. Was there a story in it? And it was interesting. Some of the background is that in 1941, Franklin Roosevelt signed an emergency decree allowing the Navy to use the island of Culebra for target practice. And at the time, there were actually people living on the island. There were 800 of them living on the island, or actually at that time, more than 1,000. And they've been there since Spanish colonial times. So, but under the emergency decree, they said, okay, yeah, we can do it for a while. 30 years later, 1970, they were still shelling the island under the emergency decree from World War II. And the Navy, because Vietnam was going on, decided that they were going to, they wanted to take over the whole island, and they were going to evict all of the residents. Well, the mayor of Culebra, sort of, it was the mouse that roared. It was wonderful. He stood up and he said, well, you know something, I'm going to hold an election on the island, and we're going to vote whether we want to evict the Navy out of Culebra. And he did. And he held this election, and of course the Navy lost 852 votes to 1. The village idiot, of course, you know, voted for them to stay. But in any event, that was the story. I mean, you had a conflict. You had David versus Goliath. You had a wonderful character in the mayor who was self-effacing, just a classic Jimmy Stewart character, Puerto Rican Ramon Feliciano. And my mission was, I was a boat captain. I was 23 years old, pretty much right out of a maritime college. I was working for the Department of Natural Resources in Puerto Rico. My mission was to slip into the bombing zone and document the damage the Navy was doing to the reefs so the government of Puerto Rico could file an environmental impact statement to get them to stop the bombing. That's the story. In trying to decide whether I had a story there, it was the same thing when I had to write a one-pager for National Geographic. It was, do I have a conflict? Do I have a burning question? That's a classic dramatic device. What is the question raised at the beginning of the film that the audience wants to stick around for 50 minutes, you know, to hear the answer? Was there a question I could raise at the beginning of the book so that readers would want to plow through almost 300 pages to see what the answer was? So it was characters, burning question, good story, beginning, middle, and end. You know, it's kind of universal. I'm not sure how that works for you guys, you know, with quicker deadlines in a shorter, in the short form project. You know, how would those elements work in what you guys do?
No, it's universal. That's
Yeah.
exactly, except we don't need an end.
Yeah.
All we want are the characters and the
Right.
conflict. It's like if you go back to your literature days,
Yeah.
everything from the Odyssey on now to the good novels that you read, like the James Lee Burks of the world. It's character and it's plot. It's in conflict. And like I said, we don't even need an end.
You don't need an end because it's like a Dickens.
Just keeps going.
It's a Dickens serial that goes on.
Just keeps going.
Yeah. Okay, that works.
So, Curtis, one of the comments that Senator Levin made was that it would be nice to not have all of these news stories focus on conflict. Is that possible? Are we ever going to see, you know, ocean news coverage that isn't about conflict?
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe not. I mean, but we got to remember that some conflicts are resolved successfully, and I think that's the issue there. Is that Seth's absolutely right. Storytelling is necessarily based on some element of conflict. You know, there's got to be a sort of peg, a sort of tension for this. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everything has to be really negative news. In fact, there was a fairly large debate about this in the environmental journalism community just about a year ago when a popular freelance science writer, posted on her blog, she was using the Lorax metaphor from Dr. Seuss, and she basically says, not everything has to be a Lorax tale of environmental destruction, you know. We can focus on the good, and in fact, you know, she made the same argument that Levin was doing, is that, you know, we need to focus on the success stories, otherwise we really risk, you know, fostering a sort of jaded public that is so discouraged by the, you know, prospects for success that they become sort of apathetic. So I think it actually is an issue in environmental journalism. You know, on the other hand, there's a reason that where journalists tend to focus on the negative. It's not just because they need conflict in their story, but it's because we have many very serious lingering problems, you know, with the oceans, coastal issues, the Great Lakes, and, you know, those need addressing first in some ways. Once something is a success story, well, that's great, you know, that's fine, it's kind of dealt with, but, you know, it's the problems that we really need to address first, I think, as journalists. We do have to prioritize those above the success stories, and, you know, that may make us seem like the Lorax sometimes, but it's the way it is.
I mean, let me ask a question to all of you. Would you read a story that 99.9% of the airplanes that take off today are going to land safely? And that's fine. You may read it the first time because, I mean, I know I've written, because I've also didn't have airplane crashes in the past as part of my amorphous beat, that look, air travel is much safer. You write that once. Would you read it a day later again, or a week later, or a month later? Those are the type of stories you write once every year or 2 or 3 or 10. But you can't write them daily because there's not much else new to say. And the essence of news is the first 3 letters, new, N-E-W.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd read it any time I was about to fly.
News you can use, as they say. So this is a question that we were planning to discuss anyway, but clearly there's a lot of interest in it. Thank you. I did not expect this many questions. So, wow. But there's a lot of interest. Several people have asked this question. So now is the time to ask you all, and I'd like to start with Mark and then move on down, how you see your respective roles with regard to informing the public, affecting public discourse, maybe. What is your agenda?
That's an interesting question, and I'm glad you started with me because I actually have to divide myself into 2 different people. First of all, let's go back to Hurricane Katrina. My house was in an area called Lakeview. It had 15 feet of water in it. The house was flooded by a failure of a flood wall caused by improper design by the Army Corps of Engineers. My beat is covering the Army Corps of Engineers. Prior to Katrina, if somebody had come to me and said, hey, the Corps of Engineers is going to destroy your home and your life, and we want you to cover that story, I'd say, I can't do that. It's you know, that's obviously a conflict. After Katrina, 40% of our staff lost their homes, and we had no choice. We had to cover it. So I had to put that stuff in a box and set it aside. It really didn't matter anyway because I understood how it happened and everything else, and they understood how it happened. And so it really, that part wasn't, you know, it wasn't the issue between me and them. It was just trying to tell what the story was. So that's that piece of it. I continued to be an advocate to make sure that the Army Corps of Engineers is doing the proper job in building things correctly. That's part of a journalist's role. Fast forward to today, National Hurricane Center has had problems trying to figure out how to tell people about storm surge. And that, of course, was one of the key problems. It was the instigator of the failures during Hurricane Katrina, and we're, you know, ground zero for that. Last year, Hurricane Isaac came. Communities outside the newly completed, brand new, modern levee system flooded because of storm surge and because the warnings that went out did not accurately portray what would happen in their neighborhoods, and so they stayed and ended up getting flooded. I wrote stories about that. We editorialized about it, and the Hurricane Center said, come here, we need to talk to you about that. So I went down there and they said, we've got this really great plan where we're going to have these brand new maps that will show exactly what happens in the neighborhoods. As soon as we get the money to be able to put this into our process, maybe this year, maybe next, we'll let you know. The beginning of this hurricane season, it's nope, don't have it this year, it's got to be next year, so we're still going to be doing it exactly the same way. That's, again, a story that I'll be covering. Now you move forward to BP and the oil spill. What is my role there? It's much more the traditional thing. I have to figure out what is going on and trying to cover all this stuff with what largely has been, up until this point, a huge amount of information, but it's also a lack of information in trying to pull all this stuff together, getting tiny little slices of information and figuring out what's the most important. I pick and choose based on my own knowledge of the science.
Thank you.
I think you can, for me, the difference in what I do and what I don't do in terms of advocacy versus reporting is really just one word. It's should. My reporting, for example, on climate change says, here's what's happening, here's what's projected to happen, then that's where I stop. Whether, when you look at it and say, here, temperatures will rise this much by 2100 if we continue on the current path, that's what I'll write. And I'll talk to, if I'm writing policy, I will talk to people who say, we should do something or we shouldn't do something. But my job is not to tell you what should happen. It's just to tell you what is happening or what might happen under certain conditions or might not happen. It's not my job to tell you should. Personally, when I'm at home or with my friends, that's different. But as a reporter, my feelings are, I'm just going to lay out the facts, then it's someone else's job, even though I've been in hurricane central areas too. Part of my other job, and Mark does this, and when I lived in Florida working for a newspaper in Florida, say, okay, if you live here, here's what you do to prepare yourself for a hurricane. But that, and in that way, it's a should, but it's just, I'm not saying do it or else, this is what a smart person does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I'd say if we're advocates for anything, it's simply advocates for truth. And that often puts us on the side of the environmental movement. And so we can appear to be advocates for a particular cause when in fact what we're doing is revealing the truth about a situation. And I guess it's not our role to offer solutions. In documentary film nowadays, it's a lot tougher to talk about conservation issues. The demographics have changed. The fracturing of the market. We have so many cable channels. Everyone is competing. A lot of reality shows, even on documentary. And the demographic is basically 18 to 24-year-old males. I'll tell the story. There is a filmmaking group in Africa did this beautiful film that was entitled Cheetahs, The Race for Survival. By the time it aired on the channel, it was called Killer Cats of the Kalahari. So that kind of speaks, to the change that's going on. And yet, given that, simply by telling the truth of the way cheetahs might be threatened by what's going on in Africa, allows us, in a sense, to be advocates for the cause of saving them and preserving them. So I'd say that's kind of where we're at.
And, obviously my agenda is a bit different, being a media critic, but it's essentially better coverage of science and the environment. But what I think is interesting to note is that means that half the time I'm criticizing the press. I'm a media critic, right? And, there are plenty of opportunities to do that. I mentioned the National Oceans Policy earlier. Actually, one of the only big pulses of coverage that emerged from that event was an absolutely ridiculous article from ESPN Outdoors in 2010 that alleged that essentially it was an attempt by the Obama administration to shut down all fishing in the United States. And I mean, all fishing, like inland waterways, coastal, deep sea. It was crazy. And this one post, because it came from a relatively authoritative source, ESPN Outdoors, I mean, just caught on like wildfire in the blogosphere. And it just, perpetuated this myth that it took, months and months and months to correct, and actually still lingers to this day. So, I'm kind of constantly watching out for stuff like that. But it also means that half the time, in terms of an agenda of promoting better coverage of the environment and science, it also means that half the time I'm sticking up for the press, because often they're, the scapegoats for a lot of the things that are going wrong elsewhere in the world, and I think climate change is the perfect example, I'm sure that, Mark and Seth have tons of experience with this, perhaps Kevin as well, but, just go ahead and try writing an article about climate change on the web, and look at the kind of comments that follow afterwards. I mean, the types of insults that are hurled at journalists these days for reporting the facts are just beyond the pale. It's really it's gotten to be an ugly world out there in a lot of ways in the media online. And so, I see myself both as a critic and a defender of the press.
This is a good chance for you actually to say a little bit about trends in environmental coverage, Curtis.
Sure.
About that?
Well, they're not great, unfortunately, as I think many of you are probably aware. There's been, and this isn't, just true for the environment and science beat. The American media in general has been in a state of very rapid and severe decline for a decade or more. But, within that decline, some of the specialized beats, including environment and science in particular, which have always kind of been a sort of back burner beat in a lot of American newsrooms, have been hit particularly hard. And so there has been a really stark decline in, for example, the number of weekly newspaper science sections, where a lot of the environment coverage once fell. There's been a decline in the number of, just science and environment reporters across American newsrooms. I got in touch, we're actually all, I don't know, Kevin or you, but we're all members of the Society of Environmental Journalists here, an absolutely fantastic and ever more essential group. And I got in touch with the executive director earlier this week to, get the latest membership stats. And SEJ reached a peak membership in 2009 at just over 1,500 members. Of those, about 300 were academic or student members. In the 4 years since then, SEJ has lost almost 400 members, and they're down to about just under 1,200 now, I think. And again, about 200 are academics and students, so you see a decline there. What you also see in their membership stats is that the number of staff, people who are describing themselves as staffers, particularly at newspapers, is really plummeted. And the number who are describing themselves as freelancers or working in online media has been on the rise. So you have a lot more, freelancers, a lot more people working on online media, but you have a really severe decline in traditional media, television, newspapers, magazines, the outlets that, most of us have grown up with have taken the biggest hit. There's a lot to be hopeful for as well. There are actually quite a few new websites and news outlets that are dedicated entirely to the environment. Kevin kind of mentioned earlier, it's become a very fractured and fragmented media ecosystem. And rather than having, the big Times and the Posts and the Picayunes of the world that cover everything under the sun, you've got outlets specializing in politics or business or science and the environment. And some of them are doing absolutely excellent work. The question is, are those websites, having as broad a reach as traditional media outlets? Unfortunately, there's not a lot of hard data to go by. I actually take a somewhat optimistic view. There is, plenty of data to suggest that, people are just going to the internet in droves for their news and information. They're, abandoning TV and print, but they're going online. So I'm hoping that they're finding their way to these, new environmental websites, but it's not entirely clear whether they are or not. There's also the fact that in this fragmented media ecosystem, not all of it is this, nice objective reporting that Seth was describing. It's not all just the facts. There is a lot of you should in online media. There's a lot of advocacy. The lines between objective, impartial journalism and advocacy-oriented media reporting have definitely been blurred. So there's a much greater onus on news consumers when they're online to know what they're getting into. It's sort of a buyer beware type of situation. They got to ask themselves where the information they're seeing is coming from, who's produced it, who paid for it. It's a much more rough and tumble world.
Let me just add two little pieces of that. The first one is that not only are we as reporters in the media competing with each other, but we're also competing with all of the groups, whether they're whichever side they're on. And the BP spill is a good example of that. The first thing that went up were Facebook and Twitter pages for all of the players, all of the federal agencies, all of the companies that were involved, and they were publishing stuff repeatedly during the day, every day, while at the same time holding press conferences every day, 2 or 3 times a day in the first couple of months of after the spill. So we are actually competing online with that information because it's all out there. That's number one. The other thing is that the reality is that newsrooms, traditional newsrooms, and even the modern online newsrooms can't afford to have reporters like me who are just covering the environment. They have to have reporters who are covering beats that are geographic in location or have a broader range of things. And so our newsroom, we're actually covering more environmental issues because all of our reporters, because we are where we are in New Orleans, are covering environmental issues. And they're all learning as they move forward how to cover the environment. But we've got more reporters covering environment now than we've ever had in my history working for the news organization.
Yeah, this is one of. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing, which is I don't think any of us can really predict the kind of environmental reporting we're going to have 5 years from now or 10 years from now. I'm looking out in the audience and I see one of my former students, Gabriella, out there, who did an absolutely beautiful piece on wilderness. It was like a tone poem. And it won first place at the Grays Reef Ocean Film Festival. And I was thinking the kind of work that she did in that piece and the kind of work her fellow students are doing, it's wonderful, it's surprising. One of our things at Savannah College of Art and Design is National Geographic has paid for a series of internships for students like Gabriella to do these 1 or 2 minute viral videos to talk about ocean-oriented solutions to ocean-oriented problems. And what comes out, I could never have done any of that work. It's so fresh, imaginative, and so contemporary. Mm-hmm. And so as I look out at all the young faces out here in the audience, I go, guys, go for it, and I look forward to seeing the kind of work that you do in the future, and I know it's going to be amazing.
That actually relates to a question that we got here, which is, someone wrote, the biggest quote-unquote news outlet for my 3 kids, ages 11 through 16, is YouTube, believe it or not.
Yep.
Facebook is another popular news vector for my children. Mm-hmm. What are traditional media outlets doing about this? How do traditional reporters react to this?
When we go out on an assignment, we bring our iPhones with us, and we are asked to do video and picture as well, and all of our video goes up on YouTube. So if you're looking for stuff in New Orleans on YouTube, NOLA.com will be there.
Great.
AP isn't quite there yet because we tend to be slower. The larger you get, the slower moving you get. Like I said, we're just catching up with websites. But this is, and when those kids get to be 17, 18, 19, they'll get their news from Colbert and from Jon Stewart. And then when they get to be our age, they'll be using, what's left of newspapers and newspapers' websites. The news will get out there, and it's just the different forms. The forms will change, and where you find it will change. Hopefully the people producing it won't as much. And that's the key. I mean, Mark's going out with his iPhone doing this. It's still the same process of finding out what's true and what's happening. It's just the way it's reflected is different.
At the beginning of the BP trial, our coverage was by Twitter. We basically had a Twitter feed built into our website, and we're tweeting every witness and what they were saying. So we were basically writing the story 140 characters at a time.
I mean, Twitter has actually probably changed things more than YouTube. And again, AP is barely catching up. I'm not allowed to tweet something until it's actually on the wires so that my members could have it yet. So I have news that I want to tweet, but I have to wait until it gets through editors and onto the system. So we're always behind. It's always horribly.
I'll just add one thing, which is that National Geographic has had in development for a while the idea of a virtual channel. And it's actually designed for students and student films so that they can put their work up there where they're actually most likely to see everybody walking around like this nowadays. I don't think actually there is a kid who knows what a cloud is anymore because they're sort of like this.
But anyway,
yes, yeah.
Before we leave this Twitter thing, one of the questions was, do you feel Twitter has changed how news is reported? And I think we've kind of answered that. But if something is popular on Twitter, this person asks, is that a hint for you to report it? And, by the way, this is a great question. What are your Twitter handles for the group here so they can follow you?
Okay. Well, I'm M. Schlefstein. That's my Twitter handle. So in terms of, we actually have people in our newsroom who do nothing but follow what is going on and put up posts based on trends that are happening, where they try to link those posts to something that's happening in New Orleans. They are, part of our newsroom, and it's part of this new idea of what we do for a living. So,
I'm at Borenbears, BORENBEARS. I violate AP standards that way, but I had it before they created the standards. And I use it more to figure, yes, it tells me what's happening. There are other colleagues in general assignment who follow the trends and do stories. What I'm noticing is if it's a story that I'm not writing about and it's getting a lot of play on Twitter, that convinces me that maybe I should write about it. But more likely than not, to be honest, I want to write about it, and I haven't been able to convince higher-ups. And it's a useful tool to convince higher-ups that this is important. And if I don't think it's important, it's something you ignore.
Well, I'm the dinosaur here. I neither text nor Twitter.
Okay.
And I'm at cbrainerd. And Twitter is actually very essential for me because in terms of covering the media, I look at Twitter as sort of a digital playground, where all the journalists are hanging out, and you find little conversations going on over in this corner and this corner, and you can kind of check in various ones. And I absolutely find that if there's a story that a lot of people are talking about, that's just come out in the Times or anywhere, really, and it's got people talking on Twitter, then that's a clue to me that that's something, I need to take a look at perhaps in a longer post on CJR. So I absolutely use Twitter. And, it kind of gives me a sense of how people feel about this, any particular story. Is the coverage good? Is the coverage bad? So I find it very, very useful. In terms of the way I actually report things, I'll also use it, as many journalists do now, to kick something out as soon as it breaks. There has become this sort of tiered process where you report something first in 140 characters on Twitter, and then in a couple hundred characters on Tumblr, and then, the full-fledged, post on your website or article in your paper. But, so for example, if I hear that the Washington Post is, just fired its environment reporter or something like that, which, hasn't happened, although it recently changed its environment reporter. I'll kick that out as soon as I hear it on Twitter. And then I'll go and I'll call the Post and I'll figure out what's happening and I'll write a longer post for the website.
I mean, I have two screens. When I work, I have two screens like many people do. One is always on TweetDeck, and I basically do my work on the other.
So let's switch gears again and talk about some of the stories that you all think are not getting covered as much as they should be. I don't know if you can say this or not, but many people are curious about this. And there's also a related question in here, which is what can or should NGOs do to fill gaps in ocean news coverage?
Well, yeah. Can I start?
Yes, please.
Okay. What's the story I'm not covering that I should be covering? And it's something that I've been thinking about a lot because of this conference. And it is, what has the oil spill done in the Deep Gulf? And what kind of money that is coming out of the oil spill is going to go back into the Deep Gulf, which is at the moment nothing that I can see. So that's a story that needs to be done, and we should all be doing that. The other.
What can NGOs do?
Okay, so what can NGOs do? In New Orleans, we have a local NGO that actually has put up a site where people can call in or go on the internet and file reports about odors or flares or anything environmental that they see that is being used by another NGO that does daily flights over the Gulf of Mexico to look for oil. And this stuff is then broadcast out to anybody who is interested in signing up for it, which I use often as tips to figure out whether or not we need to write yet another story about the chemical plant down the road, which has a release, and why our state Department of Environmental Quality isn't doing anything about it.
To me, this underreported story in oceans and environment is ocean acidification. And the trouble with that is you can write that once, and then you come back 6 months later, what's changed? Well, not really anything. So then you have an editor saying, well, why are we writing about it again? Nothing has changed, which in itself is an issue, but it's not news if it hasn't changed. And ocean acidification is something that is sort of like where climate change was 20 years ago. It doesn't quite affect people's daily lives. That's why we don't see it as much. Sea level rise has now started to be there. And if you just take a look at climate change, you see this is why you could see how the issue of timeliness is what influences things. We're now writing an awful lot about climate change because of climate extremes, because of sea level rise in places, like Superstorm Sandy. Ocean acidification doesn't have these extremes like that come, these large events that affect people. Which brings me to the NGOs. I think NGOs have to start, if they want more attention, need to start thinking more about story and more about data, because data is always interesting and always helps with a story.
Accurate data.
Accurate data. And to be honest, if you give me data, I just want to know where you got it so I can find it myself, because not that I don't trust you, but I don't. In journalism, they tell you if your mother tells you she loves you, check it out. I don't use anyone else's data. But if you find good data and it's interesting and say, here's where I got it, I will download the same data and use it. Look for stuff that's not incremental. Look for what Kevin talks about, the big story that could be told through a small person.
Let me just quickly follow up on that about ocean acidification and why it's not an issue. It needs a Nancy Rabelais. Okay, Nancy Rabelais is a scientist at Louisiana University's Marine Consortium on the coast in Louisiana, who for almost 20 years has been going out every year, has a cruise along the Gulf Coast to measure hypoxia, the dead zone. She created the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico.
Well, no, she didn't create it.
Yeah, let's rephrase that.
We gave it the name, and she's been monitoring it. And the result of that was that you had a measurement. You had we have an annual story. Every year that cruise gets done, until somebody decides that, that sequestration, there's no more money for it, and we have a story. That same sort of metric will have to happen with ocean acidification, where somebody comes out with an annual report saying the acidification has now spread to here, or there were these patches this year in this area. That will make that a story that will be news.
And in doing so, she created a database.
Yeah.
You can now say the dead zone in 2012 was X times worse than the dead zone in 1997.
Yes.
I hope someone just tweeted ocean acidification needs a Nancy Rabelais, right? Okay, good.
I have to agree with ocean acidification because my book is basically about the Navy shelling the coral reefs in Culebra. Well, that stopped in 1975. If you go back to Culebra now, you'll find some absolutely wonderful reefs, those that survived Hurricane Hugo in '89. But there's a recovery there. But with ocean acidification, no. And it's interesting because I've presented the book and given some talks to a number of different groups, and I would ask at the end, how many of you have heard of ocean acidification? And 2, 3 hands will go up. And I think there are a couple of things involved there. We've had this discussion before. Number one, ocean acidification. It's sort of like high school chemistry 203. What does that mean? It's hard to put your arms around it and embrace it as a challenge. And just this morning, and actually while you were talking, I was thinking, what's the solution? Disney, Finding Nemo. Nemo goes back, to where he was raised, to the reefs, and they're dissolved, okay? So I'm serious, though. That's the kind of thing that we need. And when you're talking about characters, it's very hard, in the case of ocean acidification, to find human characters, that are challenged by this. Whereas if we talk about the Nemos, they're characters too, in a sense. And maybe that's the kind of storytelling we need to do. Need to talk about, the reef critters that are suffering as a result of this and the ones that are disappearing and how it's spreading, from all over the oceans.
See, I don't think talking reefs and ocean acidification will work. That's what's been going on for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
Most people in the world, especially in the United States, never go to a reef. They never see a reef. A reef could be Mars for all they know. Mm-hmm. That doesn't work. It just hasn't worked for the last 10 years. People don't care. You need to bring it closer to them. And you do need the character. And if you look at sfgate.com, San Francisco Chronicles paper, within the past week, and I don't remember who did it, and I wish I could remember, someone did a wonderful piece about Ken Caldera, who's a scientist at Stanford, one of the best climate change scientists out there, who's doing an experiment with acidification and going out and essentially trying to geoengineer, bring back the alkaline level a bit. And that's the type of thing you need.
I've already mentioned the National Oceans Policy. I think that's been a huge oversight. I think it's been the biggest oversight in the last few years because it gets into everything that we've been talking about. I mean, it's energy use, it's recreation, it's species, it's, naval exercises, and, everything you can imagine. And talk about a story rife with conflict and tension. I mean, this is it. There's so many ways to write about this. But I've kind of already discussed that. Another one I think is a big one. We've been talking about sea level rise a lot, and this is maybe slightly more terrestrial in nature, but I think there's coastal development goes undercovered. After Hurricane Sandy came barreling up the eastern seaboard, there was a lot of attention to climate change, which was great. It sparked a huge amount of interest in the climate story. But in a way, and I caught a lot of flack for arguing this at CJR, climate change, though it's a major problem in terms of, storms like Sandy and, living on the coast, there are much more immediate things that we're doing to put ourselves in harm's way, and that's breakneck coastal development. So for instance, Michael Bloomberg, mayor of New York City, got a ton of attention after Hurricane Sandy because he finally throws his weight behind Obama in the presidential campaign, and that's viewed as sort of a big turning point. And he says, I'm doing it because, Obama supports action on climate change, and that's what we need if we're going to, avoid catastrophes like this in the future. Meanwhile, Bloomberg is approving development plans for, new zoning that goes like out over the water in New York. It's a complete double standard, and the media just totally overlook it. Yes, the seas are inexorably rising, but we're marching to them like lemmings, and we forget that, and none of this is to say that we should, the media shouldn't use these opportunities, major storms, major floods, to cover climate change and sea level rise. But we can't lose sight of some of the more immediate things that we're doing to put ourselves in harm's way along our coasts. And I'm just going to mention one more because it hasn't really come up, but overfishing, I think, is a huge undercovered issue. I mean, we have so many fish stocks that are just on the verge of collapse, and it gets written about from time to time, but just not nearly enough. I mean, it's really, we're in kind of bad shape out there, and there's not a lot of coverage.
So let me just note that this man right here actually won a Pulitzer for his coverage about overfishing once upon a time. But so I want to make two comments here. One is picking up on what Seth said about reefs being foreign to so many people. There's actually really interesting research from, I think it was Tony Lazarowitz at the Yale Project on Climate Change, about, with regard to climate change, how often the images that are used in the news media to go along with a story about climate change are of glaciers and polar bears. Two things to which most people have absolutely no connection. They've never personally seen, other than in a zoo, a polar bear or a glacier. And therefore, that only serves to further distance the impacts of climate change for most people when they read one of these stories. So just an interesting point that I think really underscores your point about reefs. But I want to move on to something else here, which is about pitching. So given the fact that we can all agree there are many topics that don't get reported enough, someone asked, do you think the Enviro Oceans community has gotten better at pitching you stories? If so, or if not, how can we do a better job at getting our issues covered?
Can I start with that one? I think it's in terms of the community, it's very dependent on the organization and their PR person. I think you want to tell me, first I'm going to give you my rules to pitch to me, and they're often the same for, don't call me. Send it to me by email, sborenstein@ap.org. I think it's in there. If I don't answer you, it's either I'm busy or I'm not interested. Don't call me. When you pitch, tell me how it's different. Tell me why this is interesting compared to other things. Do it quickly. Do it while standing on one foot. Think of it that way. Like I said, I get hundreds of emails. You have to do something to stand out, but not call me. And especially don't call me after 1 or 2 p.m. That's when I'm very, very busy. So, but you want to be a storyteller in yourself, because you have to tell me a story before I can tell the world a story. And don't call me.
Feel free to call me. I don't do product stories. I don't do product stories. The ocean issues need to be off of the Louisiana coast and the Gulf of Mexico to be of importance to me, unless there's some way of tying it back to New Orleans through scientists or some other process that is happening. I can do the glaciers are melting story if I can show how that is going to have a direct effect on the rising of the Gulf of Mexico over X years, and what that means for Louisiana's rapidly eroding wetlands. In terms of charismatic megafauna, unfortunately, we don't have a problem with that right now, because we have a huge unusual event going on with dolphins dying along our coast. And I'm down there quite a bit. People are almost tired of seeing pictures of dead dolphins and pictures of us doing medical tests of dolphins. But it's an extremely important story that we'll go out and do every time, and also for the sperm whales that also live off of our shoreline. I'm interested in stories about what's actually happening and ways of explaining in reality this compendium of science that is going on from the BP deepwater oil spill and how it is going to help us understand what really happens in the Gulf of Mexico over a longer period of time in general. So,
The only thing I would say is I'm just really looking forward to seeing the way the next generation using new media approaches all of these subjects, the things they come up with. In some ways, it's really time for them to pick up the gauntlet and run with it for a while, and I want to see what they do.
And maybe just to kind of circle back around to something that was said earlier, unless there's something happening out there in the world, it's very hard for journalists to cover it, right? The challenge of covering what's not happening is very, very high. And so NGOs, I would just say, while pitching, they need to be out there agitating, and I know that they are, but they need to be able to show journalists, not just present a sort of topical, abstract story, but also be pitching, on the ground efforts, what happened last week, action, characters, keep that in mind, that stories need action and characters. So it's not all just issues-based pitches, but rather, here's what we're doing, and, whether the NGO just got stonewalled or whether they actually got their foot on the door, it helps to kind of pitch characters, pitch narratives, rather than just to pitch issues. And I might also just take this opportunity to mention that in terms of what NGOs are doing, some actually do great journalism. National Resources Defense Council puts out an excellent magazine called On Earth Magazine that actually has almost full autonomy. I mean, it's really good journalism. They're not just out there, writing stories about what the NRDC is up to. They're doing good work. Likewise, this is, an older one that we're familiar with, but Audubon Magazine, I think, is doing great. And they're...
Nature Conservancy has a really fine magazine, too. That covers a lot of good issues.
Yeah. I mean, and Audubon's actually just kind of retooling right now to try to, even expand their
And
presence.
one thing, for example, Mark wants to talk, the deep ocean. I would love to write about deep ocean issues, but you've got to be there. I mean, so little work is done on deep ocean. There's so little for us to report on. So do the work so we can write about it.
and the other thing that we all need to say, because we're all members, is SEJ is the place for you to go.
SEJ.org.
Our annual conference in October this year is in Chattanooga, and next year we're going to be in New Orleans. And we'll be looking at what's happening with BP and everything else. And SEJ also has a way of getting your press releases out to our membership.
Thank you, everybody. This was fantastic. Appreciate your time.